Um, yes, I've been struggling with this thing called the Chinese language for almost 30 years now or more, and doing most of it within China, but a lot of it in and out of China, trying to explain this language to a lot of people. So when Penguin approached me with this book, the challenge was really, well, the sort of prescription they gave me was it had to be no less than 25,000, no more than 25,000 words, which is about 120 pages. And it has to be something that is readable, accessible to different readers from different domains, and free of academic jargon and so on. So the challenge was really to get all this information into a succinct size that can be read on one airplane trip, or maybe a few trips to the bathroom in the morning. Something that you could get out of the way very quickly and get some good background information. It's about Putonghua, but really what I hope that I impress upon you on this talk is the fact that this is really an interesting story of how China basically had to drag its language kicking and screaming into the 20th century, and then even now into the 21st century. Two processes of kicking and screaming and dragging, which are very fraught with all sorts of not only linguistic problems, but political issues and social issues and notions of national identity. So it's a really interesting tale, and it's hard to sum it up, especially for people who don't know that much about the Chinese language or Chinese culture in general. But everyone here are insiders to all these issues, so it should be a lot of fun today, and we can get into question and answers. I really anticipate your questions. Enjoy getting into these issues. So we're basically talking about the fall of the Qing dynasty and the new Republican era, which starts around 1912, 13. And the map of China, as we all know, basically looked pretty much, the Qing was in charge of pretty much the same landmass that the Republican era people are in charge of. And the task ahead of them, they're forming something like a modern nation state rather than a dynastic state. And the problem is to create a state along the lines that they were looking at. The model that they were looking at would be the Western model of a sort of one nation, one language, and one people. And this was the sort of model of the advanced Western nations, the so-called Lieqiang, who had invaded them and stomped all over them for the last two dynasties. And how do we achieve this thing called wealth and power, which if you heard that phrase, fuqiang, has been the sort of holy grail for Chinese leaders since that time. So it's not a mistake to have looked at this model of one nation, one language, because that was sort of the default of these other nations, even though that actually is an illusory sort of impression that they had. But the Chinese nation, the Chinese culture and Chinese country, was far from a unified country in the sense that they were envisioning. And that's where a lot of the problem occurs. Here's a top-elect map of the Han languages. And none of these maps are very useful, strictly speaking, because they're all fake. I mean, they're all basically abstractions. There's no such thing as these clear dialect lines where people outside of that line don't speak speak another dialect. But these are useful fictions that we sort of look at as general maps of the terrain, and they're in flux. They change from time to time. But what's instructive is if you look at this map, which is basically what the Qing dynasty had and what the later Republican period had, you have these basic dialect areas of the basic standard. There's usually divided into 7 basic language groups, but that's also a fiction because these things are all blurry lines. But these are all convenient things that linguists have to focus on. But the main thing to notice is that if you think of these, if you do a counterfactual exercise and think, what if Chairman Mao had not united, kept China a political unity after 1949? What would China, and it had fractured along the lines of Europe in the Middle Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire, what would China have looked like? Well, China would look like Europe, and this could be sort of an analogy to Europe. So these dialect areas were also not just dialect areas, but cultural regions, especially when you come to an area like Canton, Guangdong province. So these would be countries in a certain sense, and you would have a country called Guangdonia, and this would be like Mandarinia, and this would be, you would have maybe Jinia, Gania, Hakkia, Minia, or whatever these. And these would be sort of countries which, when you go across these national borders, indeed, they would feel very much like going from France to Italy or from Germany to Poland or something. Because you would say, oh yes, they eat different foods here, their cuisine is different, their language is different. And this is something that probably most Chinese leaders, most people accept. The tricky problem is that this language unity has a special kind of quality to it. And which is why when we use, in English, we use the term dialects. We say that these are the different dialects of Chinese. Now this is actually a kind of a political convenience, and it has to do with the Chinese translation, translation from the Chinese term fengyan, which really just means the language of a place, a speech. But the English language translation is very crucial to them, because the fiction they want to maintain is that these things are not separate languages, they're actually merely dialects of this thing called Chinese. And that's where the problem arises, and the problem arises in the conceptualizing of making a national nation state built upon one language, is because these things are, from a linguistic standpoint, these things are not dialects in the way we think of English dialects. These are separate languages. If you look at Guangdonghua and Beijinghua, these are mutually incomprehensible languages, as different and as hard to understand as French and Italian or German and English. I mean, they're that far apart. The fiction is maintained by the fact that the entire nation was using and had used for thousands of years one Chinese character set as the language to produce written text as the language of literacy, which gave the illusion to a lot of leaders and a lot to foreign observers especially, that China already had a common language. Otherwise, how would these people be reading the same books? So the whole point of this talk, and it's very hard to get your head around it, but China has the same sorts of problems that lots of other countries do in terms of dialects, in terms of mutual incomprehensibility, in terms of lots of English-speaking parts of the world where you have a dialect issue. But in China, you have lots of confounding issues, such as the existence of Wenyanwen, the classical language of texts, and the hybrid forms that began to arise in later periods, these sort of what we call vernacular novels, vernacular fiction, that were closer to vernacular Chinese, but were still not actually records of spoken speech. They were still an artificially contrived literary language that had vernacular characteristics. And then the fact that this later period when they advocated something called Baihua was also, for a time, and still to this day, it's not exactly a record of written speech. And one of the problems of Chinese language in general and language reform during this period is that on many fronts, spoken as well as written, they had to somehow pull Chinese into the domain that had already been the default one for most of the Western world in alphabetic languages for hundreds and hundreds of years, which is that speech is the primary source of all linguistic forms, and the written language is something that's supposed to represent speech, albeit in some elevated or literary ways. But the speech is the primary function. China was the only world culture of this extent of geographic and historical extent that kept a separation between the written and spoken language up until the 20th century. So much so that it almost challenges the Saussure. There's a French linguist, Saussure, who came up with this notion of the primacy of speech, that the Chinese language and script actually is a counter narrative, or sort of goes against this Saussurean notion of that speech is primary. But I'm going to contend that actually speech is still primary. That's still the problem. Chinese and Chinese language reformers have just taken a long time to come to that realization and pull the language into a direction that would make it more conducive to what, after all, should be the goal, which is literacy, getting everyone on the same page, literally and figuratively, speaking, reading, and understanding Chinese, including foreigners. That's the quest that we're after here today, and that's the one, whether they knew it or not, they were always looking towards. Here's a map of the non-Han topolects. And by the way, here's this word topolect. Really, we should start using the word topolect, because that's a better translation of fengyan. But people don't know what you're talking about when you say topolect. Victor Mayer likes to use this, but there are other sorts of phrases you can use that besides dialect, which is a very unscientific term. But if you go to these, if you try to include the non-Han languages of Mongolian, Tibetan, then you get an even more complicated situation. And these maps are even more meaningless because the speakers are spread out. these things called dialects are continuum. There's no such thing as a hard cutoff line between a language and a dialect. The joke in my book that I use is, what is it? A language is just a dialect with a navy. So in other words, they're all like verge into different levels of comprehension or incomprehension. But where the dividing line is if this particular dialect has its own political affiliation, or a king, let's say, or a beer, or a, some kind of a independent culture, then we call it a separate language. So why is Portuguese not a dialect of Spanish? Because they have a navy. That's the point. Here's a question I want to dwell on, but here's the Empress Dowager, Cixi Taiho. She came at around this time. She was the ipso facto default leader of China, de facto leader of China at that time. What language did she speak? Well, she had a very interesting linguistic background, and you would think, being a member of the Manchu ruling clan, that she would speak Manchu. Actually, she didn't speak Manchu very well. She could read it a little bit and speak it and hear it. She certainly understood it. She was part of this imperial clan. But she was a Beijing girl. She was born and raised in the hutongs of Beijing. She was a Beijing-er, and she didn't like all these dialects. She hated these dialects that she had to contend with in the court. She thought they were ugly, she confided into lots of her lady friends her foreign friends who invited her out for tea, that all these barbarous dialects that, sound like chickens clucking. She wished that China could be unified into some unified national language, and for her it was Beijinghua, and not Manchu, which is interesting. Manchu is an interesting case because it's a dead language, essentially. So I don't know if anyone can think of another case in world history. You have a language that was actually the language of a ruling ethnic group or clan that within 100 years after the fall of that political unity, the language of that whole dynasty is dead. There's only like a few old ladies who can speak it now. Although some people are trying to bring back Manchu and try to restore it and have people learn it more. But it's essentially a dead language. Anyway, so she was at the sort of center of this sort of language, this polyglot problem. The Qing language reformers had spent time in Japan and were very impressed with the way that Japan had managed to come up with a national language. So the term that the Republicans used was Guoyu, which is, I'm sorry I didn't put it in Fanti so that I should. Guoyu came from the Japanese term that they used. And they were very impressed with how the Japanese managed to create this linguistic unity among different kinds of dialects. And the other thing was, having been trounced by the Japanese in the First Sino-Japanese War, one of the things that the Chinese military was very impressed with was the efficiency of the Japanese soldiers and the Japanese military structure. They would say, wow, all of the Japanese soldiers can read and write. This is amazing. They're able to just write orders and send them by a piece of paper 100 miles, and then they can get the orders and do the things. We can't do that because the soldiers can't read. And so they suddenly were confronted, as with many other aspects at the fall of the Qing, we have a standing army that can't read or write. How did that happen? What's wrong with us? And so this became a part of part of the realization that this linguistic unity that they were searching was not just as sort of a cultural nicety, something to be able to create great literature or have everyone reading the same novels. It was a matter of national survival and existential continued existence as a political unity. That's the main thing you have to understand. So this conference on the unification of pronunciation convenes, and it's doomed from the outset, or at least it's not well organized at the outset, because you have, first of all, people from different regions invited because of their expertise, but more of their political affiliation. They wanted to get people representing the North, the South, different ethnic minorities and so forth, and we want to come up with the standard sounds of Chinese, meaning the sounds of the 6,500 standard characters. So there's a whole lot of problems. First of all is the people there are not really trained in the modern science of Western science of linguistics, which is relatively new to China. And Chinese linguistics in the past had always been more concentrated on sounds, on notating sounds, and on indicating or coming up symbolic representations of the sounds of Chinese. That was what Chinese language studies was mostly about. Very little about grammar. In fact, most Chinese were kind of under the impression that the Chinese language had no grammar for many, many decades, hundreds of years. And so they were more fixated on sounds, and they were woefully sort of ill-equipped to actually deal with the complex issue of these that I was just talking about, was what is a dialect and what is a language, and how does dialect and language interact with each other, and how do we systematize these sorts of things. And then the other thing is that the people that they invited to attend the conference were these very politicized, fiery people, a guy named Wu Zhihui, who was a founder of the Kuomintang, and he was, if you read Chris Ray's book, Irreverence, he was an essayist and sort of the modern Howard Stern kind of guy. He's insulting people and calling names and insulting the Qing dynasty. Calling well, I won't use the words he used. It's in polite company here, but and he was someone who could was much upholding the South. So you had excuse me, you had the different regions vying for the standardization, and mainly talking about the pronunciation. The South, mainly Cantonese contingent, had a case to be made. They said, look, the Chinese, this thing called Guanhua, which is the language of officialdom, which is where the word Mandarin comes from the Portuguese, is no longer essential because the Qing state is no longer run with this Qing bureaucracy. So we can start from scratch and come up with a standard language that doesn't necessarily have to do with this kind of hybrid form of Mandarin that had been used to communicate among the Qing court. So why not use Cantonese, which is after all the language of international Chinese commerce. That's why all the immigrants that's why it used to be in the Chinatowns of America and California that everyone spoke Cantonese and not Mandarin, because that was the language from the southern states and seafaring merchants that went to the U.S. So why not Cantonese? And then you had other people who were saying, no, why not our region? Our region is language is much easier grammar and much easier to pronounce. And of course the North said, no, we're the center of power, and the Mandarin dialects outweigh, the people who speak the Mandarin dialects outnumber the other dialects by many times. So they couldn't, if you read my book, there's some sort of amusing accounts of how these fights led to fisticuffs and people, chasing each other around the hall, throwing teacups. Zhao Yanren talks about teacups literally flying during these supposed linguistic discussions. And it was so contentious that the only thing they could come up with was kind of a hybrid compromise of some of the sounds basically of the North centering around what you would, the Beijing region, but also some of the other sounds from southern dialects of these, I won't go into it too much right now, but these Rusheng sounds that if any of you know Cantonese, they have these different stops, these consonantal stops at the ends of syllables, like buk and these things. All those characters fall into the category of Rusheng. And the Southerns, there's always been a thing in Chinese saying these are the more beautiful sounds. If you're trying to recite classical poetry, Tang poetry, you're going to use the Cantonese dialect is much closer to the original Chinese from which these poets, the rhymes work better if you use Cantonese. So they were using criteria of elegance and beauty rather than practicality, and rather than choosing what we in modern linguistics would do was to come up with a descriptive standard and not a prescriptive standard. In other words, find the standards, find the way that people actually speak in a certain area, and just let's teach people based upon, we have a standard based upon an actual living language that we can point to. And instead they came up with a hybrid language that was a language that nobody spoke. So the results of this ill-advised conference and the results of the uninformed and not well-educated participants was to come up with a language that was actually an artificial language. So, and there are the original Wu Zhihui's handwritten draft. These are what familiar to us as the Bopomofu characters from Taiwan. Basically the same as they are now. That's the original manuscript of that. So let me quickly go over this. I'm going to run out of time if I get too much of it. But basically, they got the standard after lots of haggling, and then the next task was to record it onto gramophone records in order to promulgate it throughout China. That was a new technology, gramophone. So now we had a way of getting these sounds on a recorded media. So they found a guy named Wang Pu who had developed his own romanization method and was a noted linguist. He recorded a complete set of these 6,500 sounds, syllables, and when they examined it, they realized they had to ditch the whole thing because Wang Pu was a speaker of Beijing dialect and couldn't reproduce the Rusheng sounds adequately. So the whole thing was just garbage and they had to throw it away. So they said, oh, we've got to get a gaoshou to do this, to carry this thing out. So they found this guy, who's legendary linguist Zhao Yanren, who was a Tsinghua professor. He was the translator for John Dewey during his trips to China, and Bertrand Russell was a polymath. He was a mathematician, physicist, linguist, musician, wrote a composer. He also translated Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass into Chinese, the first translation of those into Chinese. And ironically, those two translations, Alice in Wonderland in Chinese was one of the first published books in Baihua, which is, Lewis Carroll would have loved that. And he actually created a bunch of nonsense characters to recreate the sound, the nonsense in the Jabberwocky poem by Lewis Carroll. It's a very interesting character. He also had an amazing ear. He could speak many dialects and that he learned after childhood, and he could mimic even Western dialects and accents. And he could do something he would amaze audiences with. He could get this is later on. He didn't do it back then. There was gramophones. But he could take a tape recorder and would do this in front of audiences and say an English sentence backwards. And not just with the letters backwards, but each of the phonemes backwards into the tape recorder. So it would come out like, and it would be nonsense. And they would take the tape and reverse it, and it would come out, says, "It is a beautiful day in Shanghai." You know, he could do this sort of thing. So this guy is a linguistic genius and an ear beyond the pale of mortal humans. And so they asked him they sent him to New York. We're going to record these sounds of 6,500 syllables. Goes into Columbia Records, probably right there after Billie Holiday had just recorded some jazz songs or something, you know, and records these stack of phonograph records, which, by the way, I would give my left arm to have recordings of that. I mean, if they're online somewhere, I'd like to know who has those. There must be sound files of those. I'd love to hear what they sounded like. Because these are the sounds of a fictional language. These are sounds of a language that was never spoken and would never be spoken. And so that is his Zhao Yanren's quip. He says, for 13 years, I was the sole speaker of this idiolect meant to be the national language of 600 million speakers. So he finishes the recordings, brings it back to China, and the committee realizes, great, now we have a record of all these sounds. And then they realize, where are we going to find the teachers to teach these things? You know, you can play them, but what teacher's going to say, nope, that's not how you pronounce this. They got the greatest linguistic genius in the world to do it, but all the teachers are going to teach are not linguistic geniuses. They're teachers that couldn't even speak Putonghua, couldn't even speak the normal quote-unquote Chinese. So what happened was many of these things. Luckily, and I say this ironically, war intervened, and they sort of lost track of this, and tempers cooled, and then after a few more years, they actually were in 1932 abandoned this whole silly idea and said, all right, for the sound system of this new national language, Guoyu, let's just use the sounds of Beijing dialect, Putonghua, you know. And it's, so now in the evolutionary process of going from Guoyu up to a present Putonghua, this is sort of a stage where they've chosen the Beijing dialect. And this is, you know, the phonology, this is where they framed it, the phonology of the Beijing dialect and the grammar and vocabulary of the northern Mandarin dialects. So the northern Mandarin dialects, if you know anything about Chinese and you speak any of those dialects, they're quite varied, and many of those are not actually mutually comprehensible or are marginally mutually comprehensible. I mean, I can sort of understand Henan dialect because it just sounds like bad tones. But I don't know, Shandong dialect, no, I just can't, you know. Even, you know, anyway, it is, the notion that these northern Mandarin dialects had as sort of unified grammar and syntax is also a bit of illusory. But anyway, this is getting into the weeds. So I want to get to some other aspects. So we leave the Guoyu, the national language program, right here for a second. We'll talk about this more in a minute. But I want to talk about the other sorts of strands of the linguistic reform that the Qing and the Republican era reformers were dealing with, and that is to do with the written language and the characters. So those of you who know Chinese history know that the May 4th movement And these people that were the intellectual, the elites after the fall of the Qing, were faced with this problem that for them must have seemed like more than just a linguistic issue. It was a matter of national survival. Chinese economy was in the toilet, you had the Japanese invading, you had China at the verge of actually being eradicated, annihilated as a cultural entity, nonetheless not the least a political entity. And so the proposed solutions to the problem were just as radical and extreme as this perceived existential crisis was. So these are scholars and intellectuals, Cai Yuanpei, Lu Xun, of course, everyone knows, Chen Xuantong, Fu Sinian, Chen Duxiu you should know because one of the big writers of the May 4th movement, leaders of the May 4th intellectuals. These people all at various times, of course they all advocated the adoption of a vernacular written tradition, what they called Baihua. You know, writing that the average person could understand, that's based upon speech of the average people and that could be understood by everybody. But they also were the beginnings of a movement to abolish the Chinese characters altogether. And you had lots of intellectuals that looked at the Western model of the alphabet and could see, even though they weren't linguistically trained, they could see the advantages in pedagogy and in literacy of the Western alphabet. And then also lots of reformers who advocated replacing the Chinese written language with some other language, such as English or Esperanto. And there was these were serious proposals by serious scholars that were really earnestly trying to search for a solution to this problem of cultural eradication that they thought was imminent if China didn't, get pulled kicking and screaming into the 20th century. There was this whole school of Esperantists, people who were saying, let's get rid of Chinese language altogether and just read Esperanto, because that way all these cultural feudal relics and old-fashioned ideas can be completely excised and we can just start from afresh from a modern perspective. And Esperanto, by the way, Chinese is a culture that has actually embraced Esperanto almost more than any place else in the world. They have Esperanto societies. They publish in Esperanto radio stations. I have books at home. I have the complete translation of Hong Lo Meng in Esperanto, believe it or not. And also the works of Lao She, Xiangzi and stuff, Chaguar and stuff like that, in Esperanto. Which is, I can't read Esperanto, but I don't believe you can translate it. It's not, but anyway, the Chinese take it very seriously. And they have families that are raising their children in Esperanto. But back then it was a very serious agenda, and you have people who were actually proposing it. Hu Shi was, of course, I won't read all of this, but he was one who advocated, well, I'll just read a little bit of it. What we need today is a readable, audible, singable, speakable, dictatable language which we can read aloud without the need to translate into the spoken language. In other words, the slogan at the time was, I write what I hear, or I write what the sounds that come out of my mouth. To make a unity between what comes out of the pen and what comes out of the mouth was a sort of a goal that they had. Yeah, here was some of the slogans. Yan Wen He Yi was the main one. This is a letter from Chen Xuantong to Chen Duxiu about an article he had written in the New Youth magazine, what was it called, Xin Qingnian, about criticizing Confucius. He was to get rid of Confucius. He writes, in an earlier essay of yours, you strongly advocated the abolition of Confucianism. Concerning this proposal of yours, I think it is now the only way to save China. But upon reading it, I have thought of one more thing. If you want to abolish Confucianism, you must first abolish the Chinese written language. If you want to get rid of the average person's childish, uncivilized, obstinate way of thinking, then it is all the more essential that you first abolish the Chinese language. Now, if you didn't know the context, you would think that it was a joke, or this guy is nuts. But I mean, this was a serious proposal because they were looking, they saw the Chinese language, the legacy of it, and especially the crushing legacy not only of the characters themselves as a pedagogical problem, but also of the classical language as not only as hard to learn, esoteric, elitist, but also infused with a kind of a classical tradition that was so backward and traditional, sort of conservative, anti-women, and classist, that it was so disgusting to them that they just saw no way of keeping this tradition going all the idioms and the phrasings and the ways of doing things were just so anathema to this modern science and modernity and democracy agenda that they were pursuing, there was no other way to but just get rid of it and start anew with English or something else. Which would be nice for me, because if they'd done that, I'd be here in Chinese and we'd all be just speaking English, and I probably wouldn't be here then because it wouldn't be very interesting. Kang Youwei was someone who had this notion way back in the Qing of a sort of a universal language. So I'm going to skip ahead now and get to these other issues. But 1949, Mao does win, and in fact, Mao had spent most of his time, or lots of his time, on language, talking about these very issues that we're talking about. Mao sprung from this tradition. He was in that May 4th tradition, surrounded by these people with these ideas, to which he added the other aspect of communism, and to bring, the people were now the heroes. The people must be educated, must take place in the political process, which means we need an educated, literate peasantry, or citizenry that can take place with the revolution, which means the characters have got to go. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But Mao stood up there, gave his pronouncement. You've all heard it, and in a Hunan accent so thick that the people in Tiananmen Square had different versions of what he had said. What did he say? So Mao didn't speak Guoyu, Putonghua, and neither did Deng Xiaoping, and neither did Jiang Zemin, and neither did Hu Jintao, really. And so finally we have Xi Jinping can speak Putonghua. Yeah, great, finally. So 1955, the language law, this is the modern form that we're now working with. Putonghua is a standard form of modern Chinese with Beijing phonological system as its norm of pronunciation, northern dialects as its base dialect, and looking to exemplary modern works in Baihua for its grammatical forms. So you notice they're still not really only looking at a spoken standard. It's still a little bit prescriptive, in that they're still looking at these literary forms as the basis for grammar, but they're looking at these northern dialectical forms as the lexicon. But none of these are taken purely, as standard information, or as a standard to apply for the spoken language. For example, one of the common misconceptions is that Beijing phonology, Beijing dialect phonology, is the same as Putonghua. It's not. They modified the Beijing phonology, took some things out, kept some things in. There are many examples of that, but words like in Beijing dialect, there's a syllable say. So if you want to say, take this paper and slide it under the door, you say like say jinqu, right? But you won't find that in the dictionary for the Putonghua, sai. So there's also sounds and syllables and things that they took out. So Putonghua, though it is much closer to a spoken standard and therefore much easier to teach and learn, it's still not what the Académie Française will do. This is the language of the Parisians, and that's all there is to it, right? You don't need to prescribe anything, although of course then they try to set it in stone. But for the Chinese, they still have got in other words, one thing I try to impress on my students, this language you're learning, it's strictly speaking, is not just the naturally occurring language of the Chinese people, because there never was such a thing. And what they arrived at was not merely adopting the language of one of those subsets of people. They came up with a hybrid sort of Frankensteinian form that is close to Beijing dialect and has sort of these Mandarin characteristics, but is a kind of a patchwork quilt of different kinds of things that is now being taught. And that's what we're stuck with now, and that's what we're learning. Luckily, they made the decision to switch over to something closer to the Beijing dialect. So they have, if you're Chinese, many of you are Chinese, you probably had to go through a lot of these Putonghua promotion weeks in school, where if you're not from if you're from a Han dialect group, you probably had to get these sort of classes in school encouraging you to speak Putonghua and stuff like that. And some of these slogans here, what is it? 我爱中国，我是中国，我爱说普通话, right? So there's a little bit of conflation with, speaking this language and patriotism, right? It's a sort of national. I like this. 说好普通话，方便你我他. I found this in the men's bathroom of Capital Normal University. So I was kind of wondering if the word 方便 had a pun here, right? And then these kinds of slogans, 大力推广普通话，增强中华民族凝聚力, right? It's not, all these slogans give the impression that it's not just a linguistic unity issue. It's also the fact that, this goes back to the Qing and the post-Qing, the Mingguo reformers. There's a feeling in which if you don't speak one national language, you're not really a nation. We've all got to be speaking the same language, otherwise there's always this suspicion that you're not really one of us, that we're all not quite in the same boat. And so this is a sort of dream. It's hard to imagine national, political, and sort of spiritual unity without a sort of linguistic unity to go along with it. They are to be forgiven for this. I think there is a point there. And very often when I talk to Chinese people, like my wife who's Chinese, talk to her about this sort of thing of letting dialects flourish and having Putonghua alongside of it, the topic always comes up was, yeah, but then they won't really feel that they're Chinese if they're not speaking the same language as the radio and TV. There's something that always sort of apart from the rest of us, meaning the majority who speak this particular kind of language. So these are some other examples. You can find them. 用文明语讲普通话, right? This is, and as they were promoting this Putonghua agenda in the 1950s and 60s, you would have all these editorials and things that were sort of tortured language that it was very unclear whether speakers of the or speakers of the Han dialects were being asked to give up their local dialects or only speak them alongside the standard language. So you had this is an editorial from Li Jinxi, who was one of Mao Zedong's pals. They were trying to explain it. He said, what we mean by national language is a sort of universal language which all the people use to express their ideas. Everyone may speak it, but everyone doesn't have to speak it. Although everyone doesn't have to speak it, we want all the people to be able to speak it. For all are Chinese, and should not be that they cannot speak Chinese when they see each other. So what does it mean to speak Chinese? I mean, if I'm speaking Henan dialect, am I not speaking Chinese? I mean, you call this all parts of the Chinese language. John DeFrancis has a great statement. He says, asking someone, do you speak Chinese, is like asking a European, do you speak Romance? Because it's not a language. These are all different languages, and they're all part of this Sinitic language group. These are different languages, right? Here's another one, Zhou Enlai's 1956, after the promulgation of the language law. He says, many unintelligible dialects. See, I love this, many unintelligible dialects. To who? I mean, who speaks an unintelligible dialect? He said, we in this village don't understand what we're saying. We just speak some dialect. No one can understand us, not even our kids. They don't even know what we're doing, Many unintelligible dialects have hindered the communication between people from different dialect communities and caused many inconveniences for China's socialist construction. These phenomena must be effectively eliminated in order to protect the interests of Chinese political, economic, cultural, and national defense development. So I mean, the speakers of these standard dialects would be thought, gee, am I like a treason? Am I unpatriotic? Am I a traitor to my own country just by speaking this dialect? But they were the official policy shifted. They weren't quite sure. They didn't have a solid base. They still don't. The actual language policy about how far these languages should be forced to accede to Putonghua is still not a clear case. And that's just for the for the Han, different forms of the Han dialects, the Han languages. For the non-Han dialects, like the Xinjiang languages, the Tibetan languages, of which there are dozens and dozens, just Tibet alone has like many, many different language regions that are on borderline comprehensible. And how are they supposed to function here? Now keep in mind the Chinese Constitution guarantees the right of these minority language groups to both keep their indigenous language and also their indigenous religious practices. That's enshrined in the Constitution. So they want to keep that out there, but there's also a problem that how far do we go in the educational system? Because we want all the people of these regions to be able to speak Putonghua and understand it. And by the way, the Ministry of Education tells us that as many as 1/3 of the people in China cannot adequately communicate in Putonghua. They might be able to passively understand it, but they're not adequate in speaking it. So that's like 400 million people here who still can't speak the national language, more than the population of the United States. So we can't let that keep going on, but how do we do that? Well, we have to start teaching them Putonghua when they're kids in the schools, but then the question is the language of education to be Putonghua, or is it going to be the language of the local community, whatever it happens to be? Now, if it's the Han dialects, they can make a case. No, you got to. If you're in Henan, you're in Qingdao or something. You've got to be teaching in the course. And Shanghai here in the courses, they teach in Putonghua, but the kids speak Shanghai-hua outside the classroom and in the street and stuff. Okay, what about the Uyghur areas? What about the Mongol areas? You know, well, the people are conflicted. Many parents say, yes, teach them Putonghua because I want my kid to graduate and be able to get a good job. But then you have other parents that might think otherwise. Well, if we don't teach my kids, if our kids don't ever learn to speak Guangdonghua or Shanghai-hua, then how are they going to understand grandma? And how are they going to feel one with the family? And especially with places like Guangdong, where you have that language has a strong cultural component. There's Yueyu and there's Yueju. There's Cantonese opera. And Cantonese actually has a special character set designed just to write Cantonese. So you can actually publish books and articles in Cantonese. So it has a literate tradition as well. You're going to just make that go away? That's like a cultural annihilation. It's like genocide, But in the interest of national unity, and how far are you going to go? So you had these riots in 2010 in Tibet. Riots in Guangdong when they started taking Guangdong programming off the air, lots of the local Guangdong programming. And then Chengdu rap, where they're starting to do rap in Chengdu, in Sichuan dialect, Chengdu, which is a kind of a unity push. And then the state, the Ministry of Education and the State Administration of Radio, Film, and Television prescribes that all mass media and TV and radio programming has to be done in Putonghua. Now, there are exceptions to that, and there are always people pushing the boundaries. And there are also things like these Tom and Jerry cartoons that they put out on DVD discs. They love to dub them in different dialects, Henan dialect and things. They sell really well. People really like them. And so the censors shut them down. No dialects in cartoons. It has to be, Putonghua. But because dialects sell, people like dialects. They're cool, they're fun, they're interesting, they're cultural. They don't want them to go away, but then the government wants everyone to be. So what do? They even went so far as to, in these sort of revolutionary movies and stuff that portrayed Chairman Mao and Deng Xiaoping, they said, even the leaders in these historical dramas have to speak standard Putonghua. So then for this, you had Tang Guoqiang in these Mao movies speaking standard Putonghua, which, can you imagine Mao? That would be like George Bush speaking like an NPR announcer or something like that. And yet they tried that out, and then they finally decided, no, we're going to give some exceptions to that because it was silly. And then finally we have at least someone who now is speaking to us in Putonghua. Jolie Boy, people from Shanghai, has been one of the biggest representatives for keeping Shanghai dialect alive. And a lot of Shanghai residents are sending their kids to Shanghai language kindergartens and nursery schools and stuff to sort of keep Shanghai dialect alive. And then I've even seen lately, even radio ads and stuff talking about, let's go back to speaking Beijing dialect, because the Beijing feel like we're losing our dialect. I've heard ads on the radio saying, teach your kids, keep them up to date with Beijing dialect. We don't want it to die out. Well, what? You prescribe Putonghua in the schools, and in Beijing dialect, you're sad that it's dying out. I mean, and yet this is a serious thing. And kids, of course, Beijing kids don't speak the Beijing Hua anymore. Why should they? They've been taught otherwise in school. So as you can see, that the official language policy is conflicted, contradictory. They're not quite sure what they want. And there's the cultural side, and there's national unity side, and there's the pedagogical side. It's really quite complicated. I want to promote this site, phonemic.net. It's Phonemica, I'm sorry. It's I left out an A, sorry about that, typo. Phonemica.net, which is a couple of friends of mine have gone across the country asking people to record their local dialect. And it could be a nursery rhyme, a story, an anecdote, a joke or something. And they've got many, many hundreds of language files, MP3 files. You can listen to the local dialects. They have the phonetic transcription, they have the Putonghua translation, and an English translation. And it's very fascinating to read these, because these are dialects that are dying out at a fast rate. But even so, if you look at the local people, these are even some young people who can still talk in the local dialect and tell jokes and things. It's still amazing the dialectical and linguistic diversity of China, even now. It's just astounding. And the fact that they think this is all going to be normalized in a generation or two is impossible. Okay, in 2 minutes, let me just go over this quickly, because I hope that this will come up in question and answer. But the Chinese characters, Lu Xun supposedly on his deathbed said this. So a 4-character Chinese slogan on his deathbed, I'm sure. But it said, Han zi bu mie, Zhongguo bi wang. Now what did he mean by that? He was talking about this May 4th idea of universal literacy. He was saying if we don't get rid of these Chinese characters, we're doomed. And because they saw this as an impediment, and it was back then an impediment to universal literacy. These are the Foreign Service Institute rankings of difficulty for different languages. Group 1, 2, 3. And if you look at the numbers of hours it takes to learn Chinese, as opposed to one of these languages, you could learn all 3 of these languages in the same time it would take you to learn Chinese. And why is that? Is it because Chinese is really all that hard? No, it has to do with, these all have weird scripts. The scripts are the problem. It takes a long time for people that are from a non-alphabetic, to learn a non-alphabetic system. Why are these Chinese characters so hard? Alphabetic or phonetic languages based upon some syllabary or an alphabet, they have what I would call a virtuous circle here, a virtuous loop, where speaking, reading, and writing is this one composite skill. If you can do one, you can do the other very easily. It's just a matter of learning a few symbols, but you can basically mix and match the others. The problem with the characters is that they break that circle and they create a unvirtuous loop where speaking does not mean you can write anything, and you can write stuff and forget how it's pronounced, and so on and so forth. It's a pedagogical burden, and it's not just hard for us foreigners, it's hard for the native speakers to attain literacy in their own language. If you don't believe that, China's very proud of its literacy rate. It's up to 95%, but they don't tell you how long it takes kids to get to that level. Kids are learning Chinese, how to write characters way into junior high and high school, and then forgetting them along the way as they go off and start using WeChat. This poor Bart Simpson has to learn. And it's not me saying this. As I say, Chairman Mao said this to Edgar Snow. He said, we got to get rid of the Chinese characters. Chinese characters are so difficult to learn that even the best system of rudimentary characters or simplified teaching does not equip people with really efficient and rich vocabulary. He was already on board with this, talking to Kissinger there. Just as Chairman Mao speaking, he says, the Chinese language is not bad, but the characters are not good. Zhou Enlai says, they're very difficult to learn, blah, blah, blah. Kissinger says, there are some attempts to use an alphabet, I'm told. Zhou Enlai, first we must standardize the oral language. So even when they're talking to, this is in the 70s, they're very aware we still haven't reached a common spoken language, not to mention getting a written language. And then I want to read this, and this is the last thing I'll do here. Mao, off the record, after he sort of failed, because he was on board, he was telling, in fact, let me go to this one first. This is a letter he wrote. That's Mao's script, by the way. I mean, it's you can instantly, this is a letter he wrote to someone who was criticizing the Pinyin agenda. And Mao says, I have received and read your esteemed letter of last February, many thanks, blah, 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 blah. And then he says, Pinyin writing is a form of writing that is relatively convenient. Chinese characters are too complex and difficult. At present, we are engaged in reform along the lines of simplification, but someday in the future, we must inevitably carry out a basic reform. He's saying eventually we've got to go to a Pinyin system. And then this is the one that's off the record, and I'll into this. He's telling this to a group of cadres in a private conversation. He says, do you approve or not of adopting the Latin alphabet in the future? As I see it, there's no great problem along the broad masses. There are some problems among the intellectuals. They say, how can China adopt a foreign alphabet? However, on examination, it is better, after all, to adopt such a foreign alphabet. Several professors have said to me that Chinese characters are the best writing system of all the countries in the world and cannot be reformed. Laughter. In the Latin, if the Latin alphabet had been invented by the Chinese, probably there would not be any problem. So I'm not necessarily advocating what Mao is advocating, but the point is these are Chinese people and Chinese educators and the greatest writers of the 20th century intellectuals who all saw this problem. He said, this is going to hold us back. And I think I think you can make an argument that the difficulty of not the Chinese language, here's the thing, we got to separate language from script. They are two different things. The characters are not the Chinese language. And whether or not you can move to pinyin, we could talk about it in the question and answer. I've got strong opinions on that. But the characters, as beautiful as they are, as wonderful as they are, as culturally rich as they are, as culturally iconically Chinese as they are, which I love them dearly, and I write them, I'm obsessed with them myself, they are a hard thing to learn. They are an impediment to ease of reading, this is another thing people don't like to hear, they are a drain, an impediment on Chinese ultimate soft power goals, because they make the entry threshold into Chinese language and culture much harder than it needs to be. And so now it's not a problem of 中国必亡, the end of Chinese culture or Chinese civilization, but it's the success of China as a culture and a nation in the world in which language is so important, and we have so many foreigners trying to tackle this Chinese language. We have to at least admit that these smart people had a point, and we have to rethink how we are using Chinese language in the future. So this is separate, notice, from the notion of the problem of Putonghua. These are two separate problems, but all of these are united in the aspect that Chinese reformers and political figures who are in charge of reforming the Chinese language have faced the same problem, which is to somehow pull the Chinese language into an accessible language that everyone can read, speak easily, and that can create this goal of national unity, but at the same time make it that's user-friendly, so that not only the Chinese people can use it effectively, but that foreigners trying to get into the club can also learn it and make it part of their vocabulary as well. And so these are problems that have not gone away, that the reformers have not yet solved, and that we're still working, and I'm still working on. And that's the whole point of the talk that I'm giving today. I hope you agree with me or got something out of it. So thank you.